Hi class. Today I'm going to talk to you about Louisa May Alcott. She was born in New England into relative privilege. She moved around a lot. So when I say New England, it's not just because I didn't look up her specific location of birth. I think she lived in 12 different places in 13 years. So she's really from the region and not just one place. Like Melville, she was also friends with Hawthorne. In fact, all of the Transcendentalists were in her social circle. Her first book was something she wrote for Emerson's daughter. She was invested in the early women's rights movements, including the Declaration of Sentiments, which I'll get to in a moment. And she became the first white woman to vote in a school board election in Concord, Massachusetts. I have a little asterisk there. I'm going to plug a book. There's this book called The Women's Suffrage Movement, uh, edited by Sally Roche Wagner. And it discusses the women's suffrage movement, obviously. But one of the things that it goes into is that we have this narrative about women gaining the right to vote in 1920. We know that wasn't true for all women, and there was still a lot of voter suppression for non-white women. But interestingly, a lot of non-white women, and particularly Indigenous women, specifically in Massachusetts, had the right to vote. And white women in Massachusetts actually had the right to vote until the US Constitution revoked that right from them and made it a right only available to men. So the early women's rights movement was really influenced by the Iroquois and the women's enfranchisement there, but it also, there was a history of white women voting in Massachusetts. So she became the first to vote in this election after that right was taken away and then slowly granted back in small pockets. She started writing for money in the 1850s. She's obviously most famous for Little Women. Some of you might be thinking, oh, that's where I recognize the name from. She's sometimes published under the pseudonym A.M. Barnard. The Mysterious Key was published under her own name in 1867, and I italicize it here because it was published as a book in itself. But when you're talking about something that's a subset of a book, it would be in quotation marks. That's something I'm correcting on your guys' paper, so I just didn't want you to think I was being inconsistent. So a little bit of background. The Declaration of Sentiments was ratified by women at the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848. These are the first few lines of it. When in the course of human events, it becomes necessary for one portion of the family of man to assume among the people of the earth a position different from that which they have hitherto occupied, but one to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes that impel them to such a course. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men and women are created equal. You, I'm sure, recognize the parallelism to the Declaration of Independence. When in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and nature's God entitle them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. So I love that phrase that all men and women are created equal because it draws attention to the absence of women in the Declaration of Independence. And the entire Declaration of Sentiments, if you want to read the whole thing, follows the format of the Declaration of Independence, where the Declaration of Independence discusses the tyranny of King George. The Declaration of Sentiments discusses the tyranny of what we would today call the patriarchy, basically men subjugating women. So just as a refresher, this was a slide that we also had in our Wieland lecture. Sentimental fiction, also called domestic fiction, was a popular new form of writing that began in the 18th century and remained popular into the 19th, primarily but not exclusively popular among women readers. It was written by both men and women. Sensational fiction was an emergent form that overlapped with sentimental fiction in that it played on emotions and sensibilities of readers. Instead of emphasizing sympathy, it emphasizes sublime and sublimity. Gothic fiction would actually be a subset of sensation fiction. It overlaps with sentimentalism, of course. The seduction narrative is also something that falls in this Venn diagram. So with sentiment and sensation, Little Women obviously falls in the sentimental side, and Behind a Mask and Alcott's more sensational works fall on the sensation side. I want to tell you a little bit about a few other stories in this collection. I had mentioned to you all that I wanted to assign more than one because I actually think that they make a different kind of sense when you read them together, but I also recognize that we're getting to the point in the semester where it's midterms, it's exhausting, stress levels are picking up, so I wanted to keep your reading level short. So I'm going to talk about Behind a Mask. It's the one that this collection chose for its title, obviously. There will be spoilers while I'm on this slide. So if you want to read these for fun and you don't want spoilers, you can definitely hit mute until you see me change slides. Behind a Mask or a Woman's Power is a super weird story where the main character it is a governess who shows up to work for a family. She seems like a sweet young damsel. And at the end of the first chapter, she pulls out false teeth, lets down her hair, and she looks like just a haggard witch. And then for the rest of the story, you're like, wait, what? Did that really happen? I actually went back and reread that chapter to be like, was that someone else? Was that the old woman who she's taking care of, who looked like this terrible witch because she seems so poised and perfect throughout. Um, and she basically keeps trading up suitors. So the poor second son becomes interested in her, and she plays that attraction to get the attraction of the wealthier son, and then she plays that attraction to finally land the betrothal of the very wealthy uncle. And all of her lies come to light right after she's married. So it seems like, oh my God, there's going to be this terrible reveal. She was an actress. She is not a young damsel. She's older. She, life had been hard to her. She'd been poor. But the way that it ends is actually surprisingly happy. The uncle basically is like, I don't care about anything that happened before. She's my wife now. And all of her acting pays off. So it seems like it's going to have this weird kind of, she's tricking these men. Is she going to get her comeuppance? And then in the end, it's like, but really, this woman was treated badly by society, and doesn't she deserve some love from a rich man at the end? It's not her fault that she wasn't cruel; she was mistreated, and so that is an interesting story with an interesting twist. Pauline's Passion and Punishment is a story about a woman who is wooed by a man who then goes off to marry somebody else, and she devises this entire plan. She marries this rich young man in Cuba and then comes to society in America to basically win the affection of the man who wronged her, and she does everything that she can to basically psychologically torture the guy who wronged her. um, the Abbot's Ghost, or Maurice Treherne's Temptation, is a story about a Maurice who is disabled and in a wheelchair, and he is doted on by his young cousin. Another theme that you see throughout these is cousins dating, which at the time was not taboo in the way it is now. And in fact, if you read all of these, a common, very pandemic appropriate theme is that there are people trapped in a house. They have nowhere to go. They have no other society. So, when your female cousin visits or your male cousin visits, that's like the only way that you have to meet someone of the opposite sex who is not your direct brother or sister. And that's a big part of wooing in these stories. But Maurice is doted upon by his young female cousin. It seems like Maurice might be haunted by something bad that he did. This is the one story where there do seem to be ghosts, and it's tempting to read for that purpose. Like traditional Gothics, though, of course, it's not a ghost. You figure out who it is, and in the end of that story, Maurice's true love for his woman, his cousin, is what cures him of his disability. He sees her in some trouble, and he stands up from his wheelchair, and it's a miraculous, now he's just better, and he wasn't faking before. Love has fixed him. So disability is a common theme. um, Pauline's Passion and Punishment, not as much, but you'll see it in The Mysterious Key as well as Behind a Mask, The Abbot's Ghost. Um, it's a particularly weird representation of disability, I would say, sentimental representation of disability. So, disabled characters are to be pitied to a certain extent, but they also do have agency and sometimes are the protagonists. And so it's interesting to think about how disability functions because it's not just not PC or outdated. There's some complexity there, but thinking about why disability is a part of these stories at all is interesting. um, Another common theme is that women have limited options in society. So where there are dark emotions, it's because of those limited options. Like the Gothic, these works center on domestic spaces and raise questions about them. And I say like the Gothic here because I'm not going to categorize these stories as being specifically Gothic. So remembering the Gothic focuses on dark emotions, sketchy displaced settings, houses are compartmentalized, emphasis on dark emotions also involve critique of domesticity. The genre deals with the sublime and supernatural. It often involves themes of uncanny doubling or twins, often portrays a protagonist who's struggling with an evil person or force. And because of its emphasis in irrationality, the Gothic is considered an academic. Alcott's Gothic adjacent sentimentalism is close. So it does have dread, mystery, and suspense, but not as much terror. Its settings are enclosed houses, but they're not really decaying or sketchy. Sometimes they're quite nice mansions, but the houses themselves are isolated from the rest of the world, and so they can still feel close. The houses are, in turn, often compartmentalized, so there are things that are hidden, especially in the text that we chose for our shared reading. The emphasis on dark emotions and not spooky houses also involves a critique of dominant discourses of domesticity. Yes, Alcott is really into critiquing domesticity. The genre often deals with the sublime and supernatural. Maybe some of her stories do, some don't. Sometimes there's uncanny doubling or twins. Maybe. Um, is someone struggling with an evil person or force? I arguably yes, particularly if that force is the patriarchy, or something that is keeping women in their place. And the sentimental novel was just as degraded as the Gothic novel in American traditions until relatively recently. You had scholars beginning in the 1980s begin to resuscitate sentimental fiction, and they saw the erasure of sentimental fiction from the canon as a way of keeping women's voices out of our understanding of literature. So we don't really have those biases as much now, but at the time they were considered sort of popular writing that people did for money. And it's something that, Melville hated writing for money. Alcott didn't love it. Poe didn't love it. They all did it. So, questions for your perusal. How does Alcott invoke Gothic conventions? How does she invoke sentimental conventions? What happens when those boundaries blur? How does the story compare or contrast to previous readings? And what role does disability play in this story? Why do you think that might be important? I hope that you enjoy your reading, and I look forward to seeing what you all write about in perusal. Good night.